The Atari 2600 was originally released in September of 1977, then called the Atari VCS, or Video Computer System. It sold an astonishing number of hardware units for such an early machine, easily the #1 console in North America for years. My memories of this device are all over the place. I was only 2 years old when it launched, and by the time I was old enough to truly pay any real attention to it, it was well on its way to the video game crash of 1983. I have some fond memories of a handful of games, but overall my experience was overwhelmingly negative. I had been introduced to video games by arcade machines, and the Atari VCS was never an acceptable alternative. I can even remember my 8-year-old self chuckling at my much older cousin when he claimed he no longer needed to go to the arcade now that he had a large library of 2600 software. The idea, even to my young mind, was ludicrous. Sega did have a presence on this hardware later in its life. Starting in 1982, they began various deals with other developers, publishers, and manufacturers to bring some of their licenses to the platform. Sega even created a home division around this time called Sega Electronics, specifically aimed to bring their arcade hits to consoles. In this episode, we are going to be taking a look at the games Sega was directly involved with on the 2600, either as developer, publisher, or license holder. Let's take a look at Sega and the Atari 2600. When Frogger stormed the arcades in 1981, it was an instant success. It had been developed by Gremlin Industries, a subsidiary of Sega, for Konami, with Sega themselves publishing the game. When it came to the home rights for the 2600 cartridge version, Sega worked with Parker Brothers in 1982 to get the game done. This port was actually fairly solid, and was faithful to the arcade edition in gameplay. You guys know the drill here. Maneuver your frog across the street and river to his home, and try not to get crushed, eaten, or drowned in the process. Each time you get 5 frogs home, you move on to harder, faster versions of the playfield. The Parker Brothers take was colorful and did the game proud considering the limitations of the VCS hardware. But as solid as this port was, it was trumped in damn near every way by the version that landed on the Starpath Supercharger. If you've never heard of this before, don't feel bad, because I didn't know about it until the late 1990s myself. The Supercharger was an add-on to the 2600 that allowed it to play proprietary cassette tape games. The Supercharger part came in because it added a whopping 6 kilobytes to the 2600's RAM pool, allowing games to look vastly superior. This version of Frogger sees a number of visual improvements and plays better to boot. The only downside to this port is that it gets significantly harder than the Parker Brothers game almost immediately. While I prefer this version, I think both do the source material proud. Sega would work with Coleco in 1982 to bring home the 2600 version of Carnival, a fixed shooting gallery game that had been released in the arcade 2 years prior in 1980. The object of this one is as old as the Carnival itself. Armed with a limited amount of ammo, you need to hit as many of the moving targets as possible, with odd score and ammo bonuses mixed in. Carnival had been a simple game in the arcade, so it translated well enough onto the 2600. Here the targets are bigger, making the game easier, but the real problem comes in the lack of variety. Once you play this game for 5 minutes, you pretty much see everything it has to offer, which doesn't exactly endear you to come back for seconds. It was a pretty good score attack game if you had a friend to play with. Sega's Zaxxon had been a pretty big deal when it landed in the arcades in 1982. The isometric perspective had been a big step up from much of what we'd seen before it. Of course, the 2600 had absolutely no hope of bringing this home intact, but Sega would work with Coleco once more to make it happen. The funny thing is, I can't help but be impressed by what was accomplished here. Instead of the isometric view the arcade gave us, this was more akin to the forward-scrolling superscaler Sega would later develop. It's primitive as all get out, but still retains the height adjustments and barriers of the original. It even retains the free fire areas in between the classic playfields. These changes make it feel very much like a different game, but in the face of the impossible task of porting this one-to-one, I think what they accomplished is noteworthy. One of the better shooters on the platform. Sega would develop and publish its home 2600 version of Buck Rogers' Planet of Zoom in 1983. This is, of course, based on the arcade version of the same name that was available the year before. The original was based on Sega's VCO Object Board, a sprite scaler that was a precursor to Sega's later, more powerful superscaler machines. This is another case where the 2600 version would need to be scaled back heavily in order to even remotely resemble the source material. While I actually find the graphics here are pretty impressive, it's the gameplay that takes a hit that really hurts. The arcade version had essentially been the granddaddy of Space Harrier and Galaxy Force 2's gameplay, and the simplification of it in this version simply does it no justice. You still have the ability to move left and right, but have completely lost all vertical movement entirely. This is replaced by being able to speed up and slow down, but all this does is affect the movement rate of the enemies. The arcade version was a real looker at its launch, and the loss of its visual punch and much of its gameplay leaves this port unimpressive. With Congo Bongo tearing up arcades in 1983, Sega rushed to get a home version out that same year on the 2600, and man does it show in every way. As much as the changes Buck Rogers saw bothered me, the utter butchering of Congo Bongo on the 2600 is just an outright injustice to the original effort. The perspective here is so muddled, you don't know where to go or what to do when you first play. There is no rhyme or reason to the playfield, and the enemies and obstacles have the worst collision you can imagine. Sega would get a company called Bechtech to develop this port, a group that later butchered other 2600 ports. Utterly broken, unplayable, and a travesty on every level. Sega should be ashamed they let loose this garbage on their fans. Lucky for us, Sega's 1982 vector-based arcade marvel Star Trek was treated with much more respect. Released only a year later and ported in-house by Sega Electronics, this retains the great feel of the G80 released arcade, complete with all three screens and the majority of the gameplay. You command the Starship Enterprise on its mission to defend star bases in various sectors from enemy encroachment. You have three areas on the screen to pay attention to. One is your status, one is your overhead position on the map, and the other a first-person view of the enemies you are doing battle with. Of course, the super smooth vector-based visuals have been replaced, but what remains is done very much in a similar style and feel. The biggest thing to suffer in this port is actually the sound and music, with all the voice samples completely gone. I still like this game though, and think it's about as good as we could have expected from the good old 2600. In 1979, Sega released Deep Scan in the arcade, a shooter that had you using depth charges to blow up enemy submarines. which itself was based on a Gremlin-developed Depthcharge released in 1977. This game came home to the 2600 in 1983 as Subscan, developed in-house by Sega Electronics. Your battleship is at the heart of the enemy invasion, and you need to time your charges well to land hits. You are aided by a map at the bottom of the screen letting you know where enemies are about to advance, and later levels will have enemies trying to destroy you as well. The simple premise of this game can't be denied, but it does retain a certain challenge and playability that makes it well worth a play or two even today. Eagle-eyed Sega fans may recognize this as the minigame that was included in the Saturn version of Die Hard Arcade. Done on the same G80 vector-based hardware as Star Trek, 1982's TAC was a shoot-'em-up with nice 3D effects that allowed you to control a squadron of fighters to do battle with. The original arcade was comprised of both overhead vertically scrolling stages as well as third-person forward-scrolling playfields. The 2600 port was done in-house by Sega Electronics and only has the overhead sections from the arcade. While this does take a toll on the variety the arcade provided, these overhead sections are still pretty fun. Your squad of fighters give you a wide area of coverage with each attack, but each hit causes you not only to lose a fighter, but also their attacks. Get knocked down to one ship and you'll have a hell of a time trying to corral the enemy. Each successful mission does get you back some of your lost ships, giving you a fighting chance with each new area. Like Star Trek, the pretty vector graphics are gone, but I think they did an admirable job overall with the content. Sega Electronics developed the 2600 only release Thunderground in 1983. This is actually inspired by the second stage of the arcade game Borderline, now with you controlling a tank in a bid to destroy nuclear missile sites. It has a Dig Dug feel to the gameplay, with the entire playfield taking place underground. You'll need to tunnel around and clear out sections for your attacks to have any effectiveness. You have enemy tanks patrolling the area to stop you, giving you 3 main tasks to worry about. It's one of the better shooters on the 2600 and comes highly recommended for those that collect for the device. Atari would recognize a good thing and license Pengo from Sega in 1983 for the 2600. Based on the arcade game of the same name from the year prior, Pengo is our heroic penguin that must defend his home from Shinobi's. Set up on a playfield of ice blocks, Pengo can push these blocks and crush his enemies. He can also break these blocks to get around better. Each stage has a certain number of enemies that need to be dispatched before you can move on. Atari did a pretty decent job overall capturing the feel of the arcade game. The visuals are solid and the gameplay is easy to follow and get into. It does get pretty hard fairly fast, but that's pretty faithful to the source. I got my ass kicked in the arcade version as well. Sega snapped up the rights to Spy Hunter for the 2600 in 1984. This was based on the 1983 arcade game by Bally Midway. Sega would develop this in-house at Sega Electronics, the last game to be done so by the division as it had been sold off to Bally Midway during its development. These guys and gals must have been plenty pissed they were sold too, because this port is absolute garbage in every way. You come to expect big cuts and visuals for 2600 software, but it really hurts when the gameplay takes a nosedive too, and here it's unrecognizable from the arcade classic. It just doesn't feel like Spy Hunter to me. The terrain looks the same, the enemies look the same, and the gameplay feels so inaccurate and unforgiving. I hated every second of this. Sega also scored the publishing rights to the 2600 version of Tapper in 1984, a port of the Bally Midway arcade game from the year prior. Unlike Spy Hunter, this actually retains much of the original arcade game's appeal and gameplay. This one has you controlling a bartender who must serve his patrons while also collecting empty mugs. You can't lose a full mug or an empty one, both of which result in a lost player. It has an easy to get into flow, and I find the 2600 version here to be really playable. It even has some of the product placement the arcade version saw. Overall, it captures enough of the look and feel of the arcade to be a winner. In a bit of a role reversal, the arcade version of Up and Down would be published by Bally Midway in the US, though it was internally developed at Sega in Japan. The 2600 version was ported by Bechtech, the same guys that butchered the Congo Bongo port, and they spared no expense at doing the same here. This driving game has you collecting flags on a racetrack with a jumping truck. The play area allows you to go fast or slow, but you'll need enough momentum to get up hills so you don't stall. Right off the bat, the game looks nearly as bad as Congo Bongo. The high and low grades of terrain found in the arcade is replaced here by simple color patterns, taking gameplay that was already suspect and making it more troublesome than fun. Add in the weird diagonals and completely inaccurate jumping, and what you're left with is a frustrating experience that left me reaching for the power switch mere minutes after starting. A game to be avoided for sure. With Sega still having the rights to Frogger outside of Japan, Parker Brothers would team up with them again to do a sequel, Frogger II ThreeDeep. This is an entirely new game in the series that was not based on an arcade release. It also isn't nearly as fun as its predecessor. This time Frogger must pass sea creatures, a lake, and even a damn sky to get where he needs to go. I think the gameplay of the first was more refined and focused. What we have here feels almost like they made it to be different for the sake of. A frog jumping bird to bird in the sky just doesn't make much sense, and sometimes you can jump in the water and sometimes not. It really does seem like the developers didn't have a great outline for this game, and it just sort of fell together at the end, and this is what we were left with. It isn't terrible though, and certainly is worth a look for no other reason than its Frogger. Sega's stint on the 2600 was pretty interesting. While much of it was licensing deals of other companies' properties, they did make in-house software for a short time as Sega Electronics. This was actually the arcade game maker Gremlin that Sega had purchased a few years prior and renamed. Sega was undergoing big changes during this time as well. In mid-1983, they released their own home console in Japan, the SG-1000. And Sega was sold the next year by Gulf Western to CSK Corporation. This led to a fundamental shift in leadership in the way the company did business. Now intent on being a big presence in the home console market and to push its arcade technology to new heights, it was essentially the roots of the Sega we came to know and love during the Master System and Genesis runs. While not all the games featured here are great experiences, you can definitely feel the Sega magic in a few of them. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.